Good afternoon and welcome to Bitesize Basics. My name is Rebecca Cleal. I'm a Senior Associate in the Commercial Property team at Bitesize Solicitors, and today's topic is lease surrenders. We felt this was quite topical given the position of the commercial property market at the moment. And the purpose of today's session is to cover what is a surrender, why might you need one, and what are the points that you need to consider if you want to enter into negotiations about a surrender. Okay, so what is a surrender? So where you have a lease between a landlord and a tenant, a surrender is the mechanism where the agreement between the landlord and the tenant comes to an end. It is separate from a merger, and that's where the landlord acquires the tenant's lease. The important thing to remember is that any surrender must be undertaken by deed, so you can't vary it by contract or verbally. So why might you want one? If you're a tenant, you may be unable to comply with your obligations in the lease. So for example, payment of rent or inability to comply with your other obligations. You may be in the fortunate position that you're ready to expand your business and you're looking for larger premises. Equally, you may want to downsize as well, and you've still got 4, 5, 6 years left on your lease with no breaks in sight. Even landlords want to surrender on occasion. So for example, landlords may want the property back early from tenants if they want to redevelop the site as a whole, or if they want to sell the freehold reversion with vacant possession. So what are the things that you need to think about when you are considering a lease surrender? The first thing is whether or not there's going to be any premium paid and who is going to pay that premium. Normally premium travels in the direction of who is benefiting from the surrender. So for example, if a tenant's getting out of a lease early, they tend to have to make a payment to the landlord to compensate the landlord for that loss of rental income throughout the remainder of the lease term. If it's the landlord who wants the lease back early from the tenant and the tenant's doing really well in their premises, then it's often the landlord who has to pay the premium back to the tenant. What about dilapidations? Most leases have obligations to carry out dilapidations either during or at the end of a lease term. Will the landlord insist on those works being completed before the surrender is actioned, or will he or they require payment instead? In some cases, particularly where the landlord wants the property back, they may be prepared to even waive dilapidations obligations altogether. The third point to consider is stamp duty land tax. Yes, unfortunately, a lease surrender is a land transaction for the purposes of HMRC and Customs, and you'll need to take professional advice on whether a return and payment of SDLT is required. Don't forget, if the landlord charges VAT on the rent, that's going to have an implication on any stamp duty land tax payable. With regard to tax generally, we would strongly suggest if you are considering entering into a surrender release, you have a chat to your accountant and they can give you advice on the VAT, capital gains tax and capital allowances position on the effect of a surrender, as they do have some consequences. Under leases, yes, if you are a tenant and you want to surrender your lease, you need to give thought particularly to whether or not that will affect the underlease. And from landlord's perspective, you will need to check very carefully to see if the obligation on the undertenant to pay rent will continue to you once the intermediate lease is surrendered. So very careful points to review there. Mortgages. Normally, if a mortgage lender is involved, either as a lender to the landlord or as a lender to the tenant, they will normally need to be a party to the surrender itself, or in the case of the landlord's lender, at least consent to the same. The final point for consideration is land registry. If the tenant's lease is registered, then somebody's going to need to be responsible for removing those entries at the land registry once the surrender has been completed. Who's going to deal with that? Again, that's something that is normally set out in the deed of surrender itself. As I say, this is only ever meant to be a quick whiz through some of the key points. So in conclusion, a surrender is a fantastic mechanism for bringing a lease to an end where there are no other options, if there's no break option and you really need the relationship and the lease to come to an end. You do need to give consideration to the direction of the premium and whether the landlord has opted to tax, as that will affect the stamp duty land tax obligations. And finally, make sure it is clear who is going to deal with the land registry requirements, because you don't want old leases left on the title, either for landlord or for tenant. So that's the end of the bite-sized session today. I hope you enjoyed it. My name is Rebecca Cleal. I'm a Senior Associate at Pretties. My contact details are there. We would be more than happy to give you any advice on surrenders or other commercial property matters. So please do give us a call. Thank you.